Weather at high elevations is simply unpredictable, and in the Smokies, it is no different. Over 100,000 thunderstorms pound the United States every year. Inside these tumultuous events is one of the deadliest weather events out there: lightning strikes. Lightning strikes most often occur in July, and the victims are largely male and largely in the age group of 15 to 44 years old. On July 10th, 1980, a lightning strike at the Double Spring Gap shelter would bring death with it. What seemed to be a typical muggy summer day in the Smokies would end in tragedy. 8 hikers hiking in 3 separate groups made their way to the Double Spring Gap shelter. The group would make it to the shelter around 2:45 p.m. after traveling on the Appalachian Trail for a couple of hours. The first couple of groups to make it to the shelter sat down to unpack their gear for the night and prepare their sleeping bags. A late lunch was in order for most of the hikers, so they enjoyed the scenery while fueling up after a moderate hike. Shortly after lunch, the third group of hikers passed the shelter as they were headed farther up the trail to the Siler's Bald shelter for the night. They also stopped for lunch, but found their own place to rest down the trail. Before they could even finish their lunch, the skies turned gray and the sun had been blotted out. Over the next few minutes, the skies would open up as large raindrops turned to hail and lightning strikes lighted the sky in every direction. Immediately, all 3 groups entered the Double Spring Gap shelter to get cover from these dangerous storms. Out of the 12 bunks in the shelter, the hikers occupied 8 of them. 6 sat in the bottom bunks with their feet on the ground, and 2 lay on the top bunks as the storm's fury increased. No more than 5 minutes after the hikers took shelter, a flash of light entered the shelter, blinding everyone. A deafening crackle followed the flash of light as lightning struck a tree mere feet away from the shelter. The tree split on impact as the sap inside evaporated. The charge from the lightning trailed down the tree until it reached the ground, where it fanned out to the shelter itself. A lightning strike travels at 320,000 feet per second and can carry up to 1 billion volts with it. The temperature of a lightning strike can reach 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun. As the lightning strike traveled to the shelter, it would take advantage of the metal structure and the electrolytes inside the body of the occupants as the path of least resistance. One hiker remembered feeling a warm tingling sensation as the electricity pulsed through him. He then recounted one hiker leaping from his bunk, hands covering his ears, and screaming as he tried to escape the shelter. He was stopped from escaping by another hiker. Others inside the shelter got to their feet in confusion. One hiker was thrown to the back of their bunk from the force of electricity, while another couldn't walk and had to crawl out of their bunk due to the strike. After the initial surge, the group realized that 2 of the hikers were not moving, and one of them had nasty burn marks still sizzling from where the electricity entered or exited their body. As logic returned to the group, they realized they needed to get off the bunks and onto the floor away from any metal. During this time in the 80s, the shelter had metal chain link fences around so that bears could not bother hikers. Also, pieces of the structure were also metal, which had been a serious flaw in the safety of that shelter. Today, the shelter and bunks are made out of wood, so the electricity cannot charge through. 2 hikers lay without a pulse on the floor of the shelter, one suffering from cardiac arrest, the other from a bleeding wound in his head where the electricity either entered or exited his body. The hikers then began to try to resuscitate the downed hikers. Just as they were trying to revive their companions, another lightning strike struck close and flowed into the shelter. According to the hikers, everyone jumped and let out a scream when the electricity hit them. With 2 hikers most likely dead and another in really bad shape, the rain continued to pour while the lightning lit up the sky. The shelter was 2 miles of tough terrain and 1,000 feet of elevation away from the closest road at Clingman's Dome. 2 of the hikers made the run for help to the Clingman's Dome parking lot, where they happened to find 2 medical professionals. As the hikers recounted their horrific story, a Good Samaritan took off down the road to call help from his CB radio. Eventually, they contacted 2 rangers at the Oconaluftee Ranger Station for help. The medical professionals that first saw the hikers fleeing the shelter decided to head back to the shelter to help those in need while the hikers waited for the rangers to arrive. When the Good Samaritans reached the shelter at about 7 p.m., which was 3 hours after the first lightning strike, the scene was unimaginable. One hiker lay dead under a sleeping bag on the floor. The wife of another most likely dead hiker was trying to bring her husband back from the dead. The professionals checked on both those who had passed and who had survived, eventually getting everyone back to the Klingman's Dome parking lot at 1:30 the next morning. When all was said and done, 2 of the 8 hikers had perished from the storm that afternoon in the shelter.